Biblical scholars, in fact, maintain that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, ﷺ, is the most secure historical fact about him. For example, James Dunn, a very eminent scholar of early Christianity and the historical Jesus, says that of the two facts in the life of Jesus that command almost universal assent, and that ranks so high on the almost impossible to doubt or deny scale of historical facts, referring to the crucifixion, even very skeptical atheist and agnostic scholars have said, like Bar Ehrman, have said, the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts that we have about his life. Luke Timothy Johnson, he's a Catholic scholar. He says, the support for the mode of his death, its agents, and perhaps its co-agents is overwhelming. Jesus faced a trial before his death, was condemned and executed by crucifixion. Gerd Ludemann, who's a very skeptical atheist New Testament scholar, says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan, also a pretty skeptical scholar, identifies as a Christian, but he doesn't even really believe in God even. He says he takes it absolutely for granted that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Paula Fredrickson, a Jewish scholar, says the crucifixion is the single strongest fact we have about Jesus. The Jesus Seminar, which is a very skeptical group of scholars, claim that the crucifixion is the one indisputable fact about Jesus. Marcus Borg similarly says that some judgments are so probable as to be certain. For example, that Jesus really existed, that he really was crucified, just as Julius Caesar really existed and was assassinated. And John McIntyre, he says, even those scholars and critics who have been moved to depart from almost everything else within the historical content of Christ's presence on earth have found it impossible to think away the factuality of the death of Christ. Why have historians reached this conclusion? Bar Ehrman summarizes it well. So this is a bit of a long quote, but it's worth quoting because it really helps to give this context. He writes, in all of our early traditions, Jesus was a lower class peasant from rural Galilee who was thought by some to be the future ruler of Israel, but who instead of establishing the kingdom on earth, came to be crucified. That Jesus died by crucifixion is almost universally attested in our sources, early and late. We have traditions of Jesus's bloody execution in independent gospel sources, throughout our various epistles and other writings, and certainly in Paul, everywhere in Paul. The crucifixion of Jesus is the core of Paul's message and is attested abundantly in his writings as one of the, if not the, earliest things he knew about the man. Who would make up the idea of a crucified Messiah? No Jew that we know of. And who were Jesus' followers in the years immediately after his death? Jews living in Palestine. It is no wonder that Paul found their views so offensive. They were claiming that Jesus was God's anointed one, the one who stood under God's special favor, the great and powerful ruler over all Israel. Jesus, the man who was executed for sedition against the state, he's the one blessed of God. He's the one blessed of God, his powerful solution to the plight of the chosen people, a crucified criminal. That's worse than being crazy. It's an offense against God, blasphemous. Or so thought Paul. And so he persecuted this tiny sect of Jews and tried to destroy them. If it's hard to imagine Jews inventing the idea of a crucified Messiah, where did the idea come from? It came from historical realities. There really was a man named Jesus. Some of the things he said and possibly did made some of his followers wonder if he could be the Messiah. Eventually, they became convinced he must be the Messiah. But then he ran afoul of the authorities who had him arrested, put on trial, and condemned to execution. He was crucified. This, of course, radically disconfirmed everything his followers had thought and hoped, since he obviously was the furthest thing from the Messiah. But then something else happened. Some of them began to say that God had intervened and brought him back from the dead. The story caught on, and some, or all, we don't know, of his closest followers came to think that in fact he had been raised. This reconfirmed in a big way the hopes that had been so severely dashed by his crucifixion. For his re-inspirited followers, Jesus truly is the one favored by God. So he is the Messiah, but he's a different kind of Messiah than anyone expected. So in other words, nothing short of really powerful evidence that Jesus was crucified could have forced the first generation of followers of Jesus, ﷺ, that he was crucified and resurrected, because this ran against all of the beliefs they had developed about him during his ministry. And we know that the belief in his crucifixion and resurrection dates very early on to his ministry, as we talked about last week. So without the crucifixion, it's really historically impossible to explain how this kind of mutation in this first century Judaism that became Jewish Christianity, the beliefs of the disciples, could even have come about. So here I'm laying out the problem, and then we'll discuss this in more detail now, inshallah. And Ehrman continues, since no one would have made up the idea of a crucified Messiah, Jesus must really have existed, must really have raised messianic expectations, and must really have been crucified. No Jew would have invented him. Again, all of his followers were Jews. And it is important to remember that Jews were saying that Jesus was the crucified Messiah in the early 30s. We can date their claims to at least 32 CE, when Paul began persecuting these Jews, within 2 years after the event of the crucifixion. In fact, their claims must have originated even earlier. Paul knew Jesus' right-hand man, Peter, and Jesus' brother James. They are evidence that this belief in the crucified Messiah goes back all the way back to a short time after Jesus' death. So based on this kind of evidence, I think the supernatural substitution theory becomes very untenable. On the one hand, historically, it's impossible to argue that the disciples were aware of a substitution. It's clear for the above reasons that they sincerely held Christ to have been crucified and subsequently resurrected as well. Rather, the belief that a substitute was crucified in his place, this developed some decades later under Gnostic Christians who had come to believe that Christ wasn't a human being, but was a fully divine being, and therefore couldn't have been of flesh and blood. On the other hand, to assume that God supernaturally caused a substitution to occur, but that the disciples were not informed of it, is theologically very problematic, because it would mean that God both led Jesus' enemies and his believing followers into confusion, causing the messianic expectations about Jesus to be apparently falsified. And this is not what the ayah is saying. The ayah is saying that the Jews who are making this boast, they were following nothing but dhann, nothing but presupposition. It's not saying that God had made it appear such that Jesus was crucified in a way that would have caused that would have given a certain impression of his being crucified. So let's take a fresh look now at this verse and related verses and consider some other interpretive possibilities, as well as some contributions by some more recent studies on this topic. Dr. Ali Atai, he has this long 2-hour lecture on the crucifixion, on this particular ayah. And he nicely kind of outlines a typology of different views, different interpretations of this verse. The first one, the substitution theory, he calls literal docetism, because it's the view that Christ only appeared literally to be crucified. And this falls under two categories. There's the common view of the supernatural identity transference, either volitional, meaning that one of Christ's disciples volunteered to be crucified in his place, or punitive, um, that one of the maybe Judas Iscariot. This is suggested sometimes in the tafsir literature. Maybe Judas Iscariot was the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was caused to appear like him and was crucified in his place, which is a very satisfying solution, but it's not historically very plausible. Some of the mutakallimun, especially among the Mu'tazila, they were also uncomfortable with this idea, with the kind of implications of the supernatural identity transference. And they suggested that maybe rather there was some kind of case of mistaken identity, that somehow there was some confusion about which individual was Christ and someone else was crucified in his place. This is historically pretty hard to countenance as well, because the Romans were professional crucifiers, and they knew, and the crucifixion always involved a process of trial and flogging, and then followed by the crucifixion. And it's not really very plausible to think that they would have just executed the wrong person by mistake. A second view that particularly in the last century has caught some attention among Muslims is the swoon theory. This was a theory that was put forward by a Western writer at one point. He suggested, well, actually even before that, as early as the 1700s, there was this movement to kind of get rid of miracles in the Bible. And so all of the miracles of Jesus were reinterpreted in naturalistic terms. It's a very strange kind of movement that happened in Europe. And so some of these, this was during the Enlightenment, some of these Enlightenment scholars, they suggested that maybe Christ didn't really die on the cross, but rather he only swooned. That is, he lost consciousness, he appeared to die, and he was taken off the cross, but he was actually alive, and then he was put in the tomb. And then when on Sunday morning, the disciples or the Jesus's followers went to his tomb and found it empty, it's because he had actually survived and he had gotten up, and he was roaming about. Or maybe the disciples were actually involved in a conspiracy to keep him alive. But this has fallen out of favor completely. No one accepts this view because of what we know about Roman crucifixion. The Romans would really make sure someone was dead. This was picked up by Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, the founder of the Qadiani movement. But it was actually even picked up by some Sunni Muslim apologists like Ahmed Didat and Zakir Naik. Shabir Ali has kind of floated this idea as well. I've seen others as well. But the problem with this is just not very historically plausible, again, because of what we know about Roman crucifixion. The third sort of category of views is affirmation of Christ's crucifixion in some way. Al-Yatai calls this figurative docetism, that Christ, so that Christ, for example, maybe he died on the cross, but what God is saying here in this verse is that Christ is refuting the boast of these Jews to have killed and defeated God's Messiah, because God is saying that actually what they don't realize is that God is the one who's in control of life and death, and that this was all kind of part of God's plan. And then another view is that Christ was put on the cross, but then Allah, when it says mutawaffika ilayya, when God took his soul from Christ, he caused Christ to die, maybe only temporarily. And this is also called divine pneumatic rapture or divine pneumatic assumption. So these are a few different views. We're only going to look at a few of these views and some variations of them that I think are a little bit more on the plausible side. First, we want to look at in Surah Al-Imran, especially since this Surah Al-Imran was revealed before Surah An-Nisa. This surah also contains a verse which deals with the end of Jesus's ministry. So Surah 4, verse 157 to 158 should be read with Surah Al-Imran, Surah 3, verse 55 in the background, since it had already been revealed. And in this passage, which we've read before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they schemed, but God also schemed. God is the best of schemers. God said, Jesus, I will take you and raise you up to me. Inni mutawafika wa rafiuka ilayya, and purify you of the disbelievers. To the day of resurrection, I will make those who follow you superior, fawqa alladhina kafaru, to those who disbelieved. Then you will all return to me, and I will judge between you regarding your differences. So the key here is this phrase, Inni mutawafika wa rafiuka ilayya. What does that mean? And again, in the tafsir, you find a few different views. But the basic meaning of from tawaffa, it means to take or receive something in full. So God is saying, I will take you or I will receive you in full, whatever this means more precisely. And warafiuka ilayya, that's pretty straightforward. I will raise you to myself. Allah is saying, He will raise Christ into Allah's. Allah is saying He will raise Christ into His presence. And it could mean both in body and spirit, or possibly in spirit only. Those are both potential possibilities that we can't rule out immediately. More on this phrase, mutawafika. So it comes from the verb tawaffa, to take or receive in full. And from this comes the meaning to take someone's soul, when God is the subject. Or in the passive, tuwuffiya, meaning he died, but literally he was taken up. He was taken by God. In the Quran, this is generally used in reference to death, in 22 other instances, including in the same surah, verse 193. But it's also used in the context of sleep 2 other times, in the following verses. God receives yatawaffa, souls at the moments of their death, as well as those which do not die during their sleep. He retains one for whom he has decreed death and sends back the other until a stated term. And the other verse reads, it is he who receives you, yatawaffakum, at night, and he knows what you work by the day. Then he resurrects you in it, that a stated term may be completed. So here, even though sleep isn't specifically mentioned, it's obvious from the context that this is talking about God taking the soul, causing the person to fall asleep, and then God returns the soul in the morning, so that a person is conscious again. So because of this, there are 3 interpretations of this verse generally found in the tafsir. One is that God took Jesus' soul in a state of sleep and raised him to himself in a state of sleep. And that's the majority interpretation. Another interpretation is that God took Jesus' soul, ʿAlayhis-Salām, causing him to die and raised him to himself. And this view is attributed to Ibn Abbas, Wahab ibn Munabbi, and Ibn Ishaq. However, in each of those, there are some defect in the isnad. Well, not the Ibn Ishaq one, but the other 2. There is a defect in the isnad. And the third view is that it means God grasped Jesus in some sense and raised him to himself. yeah, so um, we'll take a look at these narrations about from Ibn attributed to Ibn Abbas and Wahab ibn Munabbi and Ibn Ishaq shortly, if I recall correctly. If not, then I'll come back and comment on them. So I just want to leave this information there for the moment, and then we'll come back to it.